Muy buenos días a todos. Para mí es un placer introducir al profesor Matt Andrews, quien es profesor de la Kennedy School of Government de la Universidad de Harvard. El profesor Andrews tiene un PhD en políticas públicas en la Universidad de Syracuse y fue especialista del sector público en el Banco Mundial, donde trabajó durante varios años. También ocupó posiciones en el gobierno de Sudáfrica y ha escrito extensivamente sobre temas de reformas institucionales en el sector público, particularmente en presupuesto y en gestión financiera del sector público. Su último libro, muy reconocido y que es lectura recomendada para todos aquellos que de una u otra manera promovemos, trabajamos o nos toca dirigir reformas institucionales en el sector público de nuestros gobiernos. Para mí es un honor y un placer presentar al profesor Matt Andrews, a quien ahora concedo el derecho de palabra.
Thank you very much. Let me take my headphones off so I'm not speaking into my own ears. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you to Carlos and your team for organizing for me to get here. It's really wonderful to have a great team that makes it very easy to travel and everything. I think we're all watching to see how you manage the snowstorm, but we have great faith. As introduced, I've spent some time working in governments. I've spent some time working in international organizations, and I've spent the last 8 years at Harvard trying to understand what I did when I was in government and working in international organizations, and examining public financial management reform and other institutional reforms around the world. So you know a little bit about me. There are a lot of you, and there's not that much I do know about you, but there are a few things. So what I do know about you, just from looking at the world, is that all of you are engaged in reform. Is that a good bet? Yes. And this is because every country I go to now, everyone is engaged in reform. That takes up a lot of money, that takes up a lot of time and a lot of letters. I don't know if your reform is in that line or if you have different acronyms, but maybe an IFMIS, an IPSIS, a GFS, an MTEF, a TSA, an IA, an EA, an OBI, a PIFA. You get the story. We have a lot of these all over us. This is a really interesting meeting because oftentimes everyone who comes to a meeting is involved in one reform, and it's about IFMIS or it's about IPSIS. Here we have people who are involved in different types of reforms, but the reforms intersect. And my understanding is that one of the goals of this next couple of days is to help people talk about the way in which reforms intersect and how we ensure that they intersect in a very profitable manner and they allow us to create functional governments, not competing reform agendas. The second thing that I know about you is that many of you who are involved in the reforms are probably not very satisfied with how well the reform is going. Because in a lot of the research that I do, I travel around the world and I spend time asking people how well their reforms are going. And the general story is, okay, but not great. And then when you start to penetrate and push, you find that there's a big question mark on the okay, and there's a lot more to say about the not great. That over 80% of the countries that I look at, whether I look at data or whether I go and I do some kind of qualitative analysis, there are very serious gaps in the reform agendas or very serious limits. Please listen to me carefully. I'm not saying that reforms are failing. I'm saying that they're going so far and then they just aren't being able to go further. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a second. So my sense is all of you are involved in reform, and the vast majority of you are probably not that happy with how your reforms are going. They look better on paper than reality, and they create a range of implementation gaps that we wonder about, but we don't know how to solve. Now, let's look at some data, and I'm not going to ask you to spend a lot of time looking at that chart because if you can see, there's exceptionally little writing on the bottom axis, and those are country names. You don't need to look at the country names. All you have to look is the bars. What we did is we looked at PIFA data, and we can do the same with OBI data, and we can do the same with any other data used to assess PFM systems. And you can separate out questions that ask, how well has a new law been passed? Or is there a new process? Or is there a new system? From questions that ask, is the law being implemented? Are people using the new processes? Are people actually engaging with the new systems? And when we look at those two sets of questions, we find that typically there's a big gap in 86% of the countries that we look at. And those are all the ones with the blue line above 0. So this is essentially some data that we have that proves that a lot of countries are building systems that people aren't using very effectively. A lot of countries are introducing new accounting modalities and methodologies that people don't follow or don't comply with on a routine basis. A lot of countries are introducing new laws that are really good laws. The problem is that we're not really implementing them. And the question is, why and what do we do about it? Now, there is a link on the bottom of the slide, and I understand you'll get the slides, where you can go and you can look at how different countries fare in terms of 3 different gaps that we've identified. One is what we call an implementation gap, which is the difference between the quality of laws passed and the implementation of the laws, and we can calculate that for a range of countries. The other one is what we call a deconcentrated gap, which is measures the difference in capability of central units like the Treasury or the Budget Office and deconcentrated units like line ministries or local governments, that says that oftentimes the concentrated entities are much stronger. And the third one is called a downstream gap, where we find that in most countries, countries make budgets much better than they execute them. So the budget system looks fantastic, but we don't really know what happens when the money gets spent. And you can go and have a look at that link, and you can see some of the data, and some of your countries will be represented there. Now, in observing this, and this is really what I've spent a lot of my time doing, is observing this gap and thinking, well, why are reforms often so limited? Why is it that we seem really good at passing laws and introducing systems, but we don't really seem to be able to get them implemented or used? And the question of this the question is so important because, you know, when I started asking it, people said, well, it's about time. Over time, the laws get implemented, and over time, the systems get used. Now, I've been doing this work for 20 years, and I have to tell you that that's not true. Over time, what we see is not that you had a system introduced in 1998 that took 12 years to be used and now is being used by 2010. What you rather found was a system introduced in 1998 that wasn't used by 2003 and 2004, that was replaced by another system in 2005, that wasn't used by 2009 and 2010, that was replaced by another system in 2011, that we still don't see being used today. Now, that is the story of most of the governments that I work in. And you could say system, you could say law, you could say accounting methodology, whatever it is. We have these solutions that don't seem to stick, and no one seems to pick up on them. Okay? And now there are 3 reasons why we think that the reforms are often limited. The first one is that reforms happen in a context. That whenever we're trying to introduce a new law, a new system, we have to recognize that there is no such thing as a blank slate. All of our countries and all of our governments have things there already. There are people who use certain systems and are used to working with different processes and different laws, and anything new requires them to change. And we have to make sense of the context and work out, is it going to work in that context? The truth is that we often ignore the context altogether, even though we say it matters, because we don't really know how to look at it. We don't know how to make sense of it. We don't know whether or not there is a lot of space for change or a small space for change, and we don't have good tools for engaging to answer that question. Apart from context, the second thing is that we usually work with reforms that require a lot of content. meaning that the laws and the systems and the processes that we introduce in this PFM world come from meetings like this oftentimes, and oftentimes are kind of best practice type things that require a lot to work. When I was in South Africa in the mid-1990s, we didn't really have a budget, and we had a significant change in government. And it was my first job in government. And we had a delegation that came from Australia. And we met with the delegation, and they said, what you guys need is you need an MTEF, a medium-term expenditure framework. You need a multi-year budget, you need performance metrics in the budget. That's what you need. Now, bear in mind, none of us had worked in a budget office before because we had a significant change in government. And I remember being a young new budgeter, listening to this guy from Australia and thinking, wow, we really do need this because everyone else does it this way. And then we started doing it, and we found out after 3 or 4 years that we were pretty much the only country outside of Australia that was doing it that way. And after 3 or 4 years, it didn't work in South Africa, and we said, well, the content required is just too much for our context. We don't have all those pieces, right? The third reason why, so there's context, there's content, and the third reason why is that institutional reforms happen through people, and they happen through organizations. And oftentimes, we don't engage with the people and the organizations who have to implement them and live with them after the fact. Oftentimes, we devise the reforms with very, very narrow groupings, either in the Treasury or in the accounting bureau in our government or in the budget department. But when you come to it, money is not spent by us. Money is spent by people in other places of government. Accounts are not written by us. They're written by people in other places of government. And budgets and plans are not executed by us. They're executed by other people. And those people are not in the discussions about the change. And because they're not in the discussions about the change, it becomes exceptionally hard to get them to move in the direction we want them to go. So I like to think of it as putting a peg into a hole. And the context is the hole, and it's very hard for us to work out what the hole looks like. The content or the reform is the peg, and oftentimes we choose a peg that is far too big and the wrong shape. And the agents are the ones who are trying to put it into the hole. And as you can see in the diagram, sometimes the only way to put a square peg into a round hole is to cut all the corners. Now let's speak about the context problem, because I think this is important when we're talking about accounting and treasury reforms. And I have a table there, and I don't want you to spend a lot of time trying to read the writing. I'm going to explain it to you. As I said, we know that context matters, but we often don't know what is it about context that matters and how do we make sense of that. Over the last few years, we've been spending a lot of time trying to understand what are the things that either make change happen in a context or that prohibit change from happening. And there are 4 factors that we settled on. And this is myself and colleagues at Harvard. The first one is change happens when you have a significant disruption, when you have a problem, when something's gone wrong. Let's talk about the crisis in 2008, which we spoke about quite a bit now. Okay? The crisis in 2008 has even got the IMF to change the structure of the ROSCs. That's a pretty impressive thing, right? But it was disrupted. What disruption does is it causes you to look at the way that you've done things and to question whether that way is a good way, right? When you question that way, it leads you to something else. So disruption matters a lot. Is there a problem that we're trying to solve? We find that where there aren't problems, but people try to introduce change, it becomes really hard because problems create a hole, and if there's no problem, the hole is very small or non-existent. Okay? The second thing that we see is, in a context, is it depends on how strong the dominant approach to doing things is. Sometimes you'll have a problem and a disruption, but people are so embedded with the way of doing things that they say, it can't be that, we're not going to change it regardless. And I'll use the IMF example again because we were talking about it. Imagine if you went back to the people in the IMF and said, we're not going to use the fiscal ROSCs because they didn't work for us in 2008. Imagine if all the staff in the IMF said, there's nothing wrong with our ROSCs, leave them alone. That's what we do, right? If it's so strong that people won't question it, it becomes very hard to change. Now, in all of our countries, we have accounting systems. In all of our countries, we have ways in which money moves through governments, okay, that existed before we introduced FMISs. In all of our countries, we have ways and understandings of how much money budget holders should hold in their own private banks. And sometimes when you come with a Treasury single account and you say you need to close those accounts and you need to combine them into one place, some people will say, no, because we don't think there's anything wrong with the way that we do it, right? We as treasurers think there's something wrong with it because we see that there's a big problem, but they don't see that problem because for them, actually losing the money is the problem. So the context becomes difficult. The third thing that facilitates change is if there are any alternative things that people can go to. So if you have a problem and you say, well, the way we do things is not that good, oftentimes people will say, but we don't know what else to do. And sometimes we don't have any alternatives, and the lack of alternatives means that you're not really going to, in that context, move to change. And the fourth thing is just the activity of change agents. How many people are provoking and promoting change versus how many people are standing in the way of change? In every situation, you get what Jim Collins, the management theorist, called the people who you want to have on the bus and the people you want to kick off the bus. So how many of those do you have on the bus who are leading you to change, and how many are actually stopping the change agenda? Now, the only thing that I do want you to think about in this table is I've got two columns. And the two columns basically say on these four issues, the degree of disruption, the strength of the incumbent way of thinking, the presence of alternatives, and the action of agents, we often make assumptions about these things that there are big holes waiting to be changed, when actually the conditions are very small. Because we come to a meeting like this and we hear people think about really exciting changes to treasury systems or accounting mechanisms, and we forget that when we go home and we assume that the world is just going to be open to our reforms, a lot of other people in our governments weren't at the same meeting. They didn't hear the same story, and they're thinking very different things. So we need to have a way of thinking about the context so that we can get the right assumption about what the whole looks like that we're trying to change. Now, the second thing I mentioned was content, and I said, apart from thinking about where we're doing reform, we think about what it is that we're doing. This is the peg that we're trying to put into the hole, right? I did a study a while ago of accounting reforms in Africa. Not accounting reforms in the public sector, but in the private sector, where the movement was towards international accounting standards. And it was a really interesting study because, when I say it was an interesting study, I guess I should say for me it was an interesting study because my wife always says it's all relative. She has no interest in what I do. She thinks that accounting is not an interesting thing. I don't know why. One of the things we found is that there were many, many countries in Africa that are compliant with international accounting standards. On paper, they are compliant with international accounting standards. But routinely, firms that go into those countries have significant problems when they try to engage business in the US because the SEC keeps saying to them, your books don't add up. There's a problem with your books. So there's a question, how can country be compliant with accounting standards, but then the accounts that are done aren't compliant with accounting standards? So we went and looked at a bunch of countries in Africa, and we found that to have a system that is compliant with accounting standards, it requires a lot, right? It requires that you have a bunch of laws that say that you need to be compliant with accounting standards. It requires that you need to have a profession that is called an accounting profession, that you have a way of certifying people in those professions, that you have a way of educating them, that you have an ongoing education program. It requires that your businesses acknowledge that it is important for them to hire a more expensive qualified accountant rather than a less expensive unqualified accountant. There are a lot of things that it takes to go into this agenda. When we looked at the African countries, what we found was that these countries did really well on the legal side of things. They passed all the laws, they had, in theory, all the associations, etc. But when you started to look at the things that you couldn't really see, the norms, the ways of thinking, the educational facilities, none of those existed. So my favorite country to talk about in this respect is Mozambique, which has been compliant with accounting standards for 15 years, but has one certified international accountant in the country. And I don't know the population, but it's something like 45 million people. Okay? So it's an interesting question. How does that work? Now, when I came out with this, what I said was the difficulty with the reforms we're putting in place, whether it's an IFMIS or whether it's an IPSIS reform, is that the reform itself is like an iceberg. It's like an iceberg where there's a part of it that we can see when we get excited about it, and that part of it is often the laws, it's often creating the formal bureau, it's doing the things that we can see, but the thing that often makes it work is way underneath the water. It's the norms, the ways of thinking. It's the cultural aspects that make people move in that direction. And these are things that are very, very difficult to put in place. And often when we see reforms that are limited, it's because those things didn't come with them. Does it make sense? Those things didn't come with them. In the management theory, there's a big literature on this that speaks about the problem with best practice. And they say, when you look at a best practice in a certain place and you say, I want to copy that because it's so good, the problem is that you aren't seeing everything that makes that best practice work. You're only seeing the parts of it that are visible to you. And the problem is that the other parts of it stay behind when you try to move it over. So you get the new law and you get the new organization, but you don't necessarily get the new culture. You don't necessarily get the full understanding. You don't necessarily get the mechanisms that brought people into the picture and facilitated the change. You get the tip of the iceberg, but not the bottom. My colleague Ricardo Hausman always says the problem with iceberg tips is that they sink. And that's what happens to many reforms. The third thing is about agency. So we've spoken about context and the idea that we often assume that the whole is bigger than it is. We've spoken about content, which says that we often adopt reforms that require a lot more than we can actually put in place for them. And then we wonder why they don't work. The third thing is about agency. Now, I've given you here a terrible diagram. For us academics, this is a fabulous diagram because it has meaning only for us, so therefore someone has to pay us to explain it to them. It's a very simple diagram, and you guys might relate to it. A very important theory for you to think about in thinking about the relationship between accountants and treasurers and budgeters and auditors is network theory. Network theory says that we are all involved in networks of relationships. And those networks of relationships influence how we think about the world, and they influence kind of where we're going to come from and definitely where we go to. The networks theorists found that most people are not employed because they don't find jobs because they look in newspapers. They find jobs because of people that they know in networks. Okay? They find that procurement contracts are not done through just through the formal procedures we have. Procurement contracts are often obtained because people know people and because that's how the world works, networks. So think of the gray circle as a network. And think of a bunch of people in that circle. Let's say this is the network of kind of treasury people in your country. Okay? That's the treasury network. And the person number A in the center of that circle is the one who we would call the most embedded in the treasury network. Okay? This is the person who is the treasurer at heart. We have some of you in the room, right? Yeah? You are a treasurer. That is your understanding of the world. Everything that we expect a treasurer to do, to control the purse, to make sure that nothing is missing, to make sure that everyone is putting their money into a single place, that is who you are at the middle. The person at the middle of this network has a lot of power. Okay? The ways of thinking in that network are embedded in that person, right? The people around them probably think very similarly to them. But now we move to the outskirts of that circle to H and to F, and particularly I want you to look at B. And one of the things you should notice about B is that B is on the outskirts of the circle, meaning they're less embedded. They're part of your treasury network, so they think a little bit like you, but they're also part of a different circle. Can you see they're part of a different circle? So let's call that different circle the budgeters' circle. And now the budgeters don't always have the same conversations as the treasurers do. And sometimes the budgeters have conversations that are not in sync with the treasurers. And the treasurers are saying everyone needs to have a single account. No one should keep their own accounts. But when the budgeters get together, they say, you know what? Sometimes it makes sense for people to have just a little bit of money on the side so that they can execute with some flexibility. Have you ever heard that conversation? No? Not in your country. Now, the problem, therefore, is that B is not thinking necessarily the same as A, right? And the bigger problem is that E doesn't think anything like A, because E is in a completely different network and thinks completely different thoughts. Now, network theory becomes a lot more complex when we start to add politics to it. And we start to say that those networks are not just about professional networks, they're about political belief. It becomes even harder when we start to speak about kind of social understandings of the world and religious beliefs and all sorts of things, because we are all complex beings. But the point of this is that if you want a treasury reform to work, or if you want an accounting reform to work, you can't just have A in the conversation, because you have to engage everybody who you need to bring into that conversation. So a few years ago, we showed this in a study in Africa. We actually were at a meeting exactly like this, but it was much bigger than this. They have a meeting of treasurers in Southern Africa every year. But they have the treasurers that come, and then they probably have about, from every country, they'll have about 20 or 30 accountants from across government, because they recognize that this is an issue. They recognize that the treasurers need to speak to the accountants and that they can't assume that they're having the same discussion. And we asked them a few questions. We asked them about their academic background. And we found that the treasurers tended to have many more years studying straight accounting and things like that than the people who were doing accounts in the line ministries. Often the people who were doing the accounts in the line ministries were not accountants at all. They had come there, they were an economist who had then learned how to do accounting on the job. Now, the professional difference, it kind of matters. It's important. We then also asked them questions about what they thought about the reforms, and we found that they had very different impressions of the reforms. That the people in the Treasury were saying, we need an FMIS. The people from the line ministries are saying, we don't know how to do an FMIS, right? The people from the line ministries were also saying, we don't think we need an FMIS. The third thing we asked them is, how much are you engaged in the dialogue of reform? And the Treasury guys said, we talk about it all the time. The line ministry guys said, no one's ever asked us. And it became really interesting, because you look at these networks and you say, well, the problem with agency is that the only people who drive reform are concentrated at the center of these networks and they feel deeply. But the ones who actually have to implement and live with it are the ones who are on the sides. And we shouldn't be assuming that they're going to go with us, but we always do, because we never include them in the dialogue. So, the result, if we think that the whole is so big, but it's not, and if we introduce content that is really, really demanding, but we don't necessarily have all the pieces to put it in place, and if we don't have discussions with all the people who we need to have discussions with, is we get reforms as signals, or what I call the whizzing wig problem. Do you know that? Do you know what whizzing wig is? No? What you see is not what you get. Okay? Meaning, we have a great treasury reform or a great accounting reform, a good law, a good system. On paper, it's really good, and we've done our job. It's just that people don't use it. Or it's just that it doesn't get implemented. Or it's just that the level of transparency that we assume is not the level of transparency in reality. Let me give you some examples about this. Looking at OBI data and PIFA data, we found that across about 110 countries with PIFA data, about 65% of the dimensions that are satisfied if you just pass a law or introduce a system, countries are doing well at. They're getting a B or an A. But only about 45% of the de facto PIFA dimensions are satisfied similarly. So there's a big gap between the kinds of laws countries have and the implementation. We find that after countries introduce FMISs, the gaps grow. Meaning often FMISs and things, they make things look better, but they don't necessarily improve the functionality as we want them to be. We find, looking at the Open Budget Index, and some of you may know this. Do you know this? Looked at the degree of transparency. Many countries have done well when they've had 2 Open Budget Index analyses, but the gap between transparency in the formulation side of the budget and execution grows. So Afghanistan is a good example. They score 67 out of 100 when they ask, how transparent are your budgetary promises? But they only score 40 when they ask how transparent is your spending. And the gap has grown over time. When we look at experience in the field, it reinforces the finding. I did some work in Mozambique after they had an FMIS, and the Minister of Finance said the FMIS is great, the World Bank has signed off on it, the IMF has signed off on it, it's a fantastic thing, works great. But then he said, but I'm a little bit worried that I don't have the full picture, can you come and have a look? So we did a test with people in the World Bank where we did an audit on transactions that were going through the FMIS. And we said it would be really interesting if we could find out essentially when was there a bid for the job, when was the job allocated, when was the invoice prepared or presented to the government, and when was the money paid. And you would expect that there'd be gaps between those things in the system. And we found that in 80% of the cases, they were all done on exactly the same day and sometimes in the wrong order, which told us that people were using the system, but they weren't managing through the system, they were reporting through the system. They were doing everything on paper, and then they were coming to the day where they needed to pay, and because you needed to pay through the system, they were putting everything through the system. Now, what's the problem? Well, the problem is you no longer have any internal controls. You don't know what your arrears are. So this is a really, really big issue, and it's something that we need to think seriously about. Now, I'm going to just give you some ideas on how to get less limited reforms, because I think that that's probably what Carlos wants me to talk about, and I know what he's going to talk about in the next session. And here's some ideas. Because institutional reforms happen in context, we need to think very, very seriously about why in a context people would want to change. And often people want to change because of problems. And if you can prove to someone that they're facing a problem and that they're not going to be able to manage if they don't change, then usually that's a good way to bring them along into the change process. It's very, very hard for us to analyze how much space we have, but we can provoke space and create it by focusing on the real problems that we face. Oftentimes I find where an FMIS works really well, it works well because it's solving problems that a broad group agreed were really problems. So for instance, FMISs usually work well in paying salaries and wages. Well, it's interesting because that's a problem when you're not paying salaries and wages. It's a problem that a lot of people agree with, right? We need to solve that. It isn't usually very good at fostering procurement deals because there's a lot of disparate interests and people can't work out what's the real problem with procurement. So focus on problems rather than introducing solutions that look for problems. Question the best practices that people have rather than just introducing them. The second thing I would say is, instead of taking solutions off the shelf, build the solutions over time. A lot of countries say, well, we're going to start with a law, and the law is going to tell us exactly how we do everything in our government. The problem is that you're assuming that you're going to be able to implement it. Most effective change that we see doesn't happen like that. It happens when people iterate, they try, they experiment with different ways of doing things, and then once they have success and they know how to do it, they then institutionalize it in some kind of law or system. Before you introduce the system, try it out, see what works, see what people can pull off. And the third thing that I would say is, because they happen through agents, work broadly from the start. Whatever it is you're trying to do, whether it's an accounting reform, whether it's a treasury reform, whatever it is, try to get the people who are going to have to implement it actually in the conversation. Probably very important for this group is recognize that accountants and treasurers think similarly about some things but differently about others. And one of the things that you can really experiment with even in these couple of days is, how do you have conversations between accountants and treasurers to get into agreement about what your reforms are doing and about how they connect with each other? Okay? See, we didn't bring the budgeters here because that's just a bridge too far. But they need to be involved too. Now, I'm not going to get into this diagram too much, but the strategy that we have come up with brings these principles together, the principles of starting with problems, of iterating gradually, and of engaging large groups in a thing called problem-driven iterative adaptation, PDIA. And in PDIA, we essentially say, governments, when you're doing these reforms, you need two things. You need support and legitimacy. You need people to say this is something that is valid, this is something that's important. But you also want functionality. You want it to solve your problems. The argument that we make is that you need to do this gradually and you need to build both the legitimacy and the functionality as you move along. Starting with the problems, iterating with experiments, bringing broad groups together, and expanding your authority and expanding the space of your reform as you move along. This makes the same point, and let me conclude with this. Implications for more effective Treasury reforms. Always ask, what is the problem? Why does it matter? What are its causes? Really important questions that we often forget when we do reforms. Why are we doing this in the first place? Why would we have any expectation that the Minister of Agriculture would tell his people or her people that they should implement our reform? What is the problem that we're trying to solve for them, not just for ourselves? Secondly, to ensure manageable content, adopt the iterative experimentation, not one-off pre-designed projects. Try multiple entry points and a range of time-bound experiments. Provide quick and aggressive opportunities for learning. We need to learn how to implement these reforms and these systems. We can't assume that we know it from the beginning. And the third thing is to ensure the broader agency engage broadly from the start. And the last thing is cultivate mobilizers. So in the last few years, we've been looking at successful reforms, and people say, well, it's all about leadership. And it's really interesting because it is all about leadership, but often the leader is not the one that you think he or she is. We often think the leader is the one at the top of the organization, and what we find is actually it's often the people who mobilize other people and bring them together. It's the ones who foster conversations and convene groups. It's the reason why I come to speak at this group today, because it's amazing to convene big groups and have people talk to each other. You guys know how much you learn from each other, right? Do we do similar things in our own countries? Cultivate mobilizers. If you don't have mobilizers, people who convene and connect, find them or become one yourself. So, thank you. I have a book, and as an academic who writes books, I have to ask you all please to buy my book, because if I don't, no one will buy it. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think we have some time for questions, and I'll be around afterwards. And if anyone wants to get hold of me, that's my email address, and I'm also on Twitter. It's really great to have been here. I hope this provides an interesting point to start your next few days' work. Thank you.